Sarah Martinez had always been a creature of habit. Every morning at exactly 6:15 a.m., she would shuffle into her small kitchen wearing the same faded blue robe her mother had given her 3 years ago. The coffee maker would already be gurgling to life, programmed the night before, because Sarah believed that consistency was the key to surviving the chaos that had become her world. On this particular Tuesday morning in March, the routine felt more necessary than ever. The small apartment in Norfolk, Virginia, seemed to echo with an emptiness that Sarah had grown accustomed to over the past 8 months. The walls, once adorned with photographs of her naval career and happier times, now felt bare despite the pictures still hanging there. She had stopped really seeing them, stopped remembering the woman who used to smile back at her from those frames. As the coffee finished brewing, Sarah reached for her favorite mug, a simple white ceramic piece with a small chip on the handle. She had bought it at a thrift store during her first deployment, and it had somehow survived 3 moves and countless washings. The familiar weight of it in her hands provided a small comfort as she poured the dark liquid, watching the steam rise and dissipate in the morning light filtering through her kitchen window. Sarah had been medically discharged from the Navy 6 months earlier after a training accident that left her with chronic back pain and what the doctors politely called adjustment difficulties. The official papers used cleaner language, but Sarah knew the truth. She was damaged goods, unable to serve the country she had devoted her adult life to protecting. The transition to civilian life had been brutal in ways she never anticipated. The apartment was quiet except for the usual sounds of her neighbors beginning their day. Mrs. Chen upstairs was running water for her morning tea, and the college students next door were already playing music too loudly for such an early hour. Sarah had learned to find comfort in these sounds, evidence that life continued around her even when her own felt suspended in time. She took her first sip of coffee and walked to the small table by her window where she kept her laptop. The screen showed 17 new job applications she had submitted the previous week, all marked as under review, or worse, position filled. Her savings account was dwindling faster than she had expected, and the disability payments, while helpful, weren't enough to sustain her current lifestyle much longer. Sarah opened her email, hoping against hope that someone, somewhere, might want to hire a former Navy communications specialist whose references all came from a world that most civilian employers didn't understand. The inbox showed the usual collection of automated rejections and spam, nothing that would change her circumstances. She was about to close the laptop when she heard something that made her freeze with the coffee mug halfway to her lips. From somewhere in the apartment building, or perhaps from outside, came the unmistakable sound of a radio transmission. Not just any radio transmission, but the specific cadence and terminology of naval communications. At first, Sarah thought she might be imagining things. The isolation and stress of unemployment had been playing tricks on her mind lately. She found herself hearing phantom sounds from her old life, dreaming about her time on the USS Montgomery, waking up expecting to be in her ship's berth instead of her civilian bed. But this sound was different. It was real, and it was close. Setting down her mug carefully, Sarah moved toward her living room, following the sound. It seemed to be coming from the direction of her back patio, though that made no sense. Her apartment was on the second floor of a converted house, and her patio overlooked a small yard that was shared with the other tenants. There was no reason for military radio traffic to be emanating from such a mundane location. The transmission continued, and Sarah found herself automatically decoding the information out of habit. Grid coordinates, weather reports, personnel updates. It was definitely Navy communications, but she couldn't identify the specific ship or unit. The voice was male, professional, with the slight static that suggested either long-range transmission or older equipment. Sarah pressed her ear against the patio door, straining to hear more clearly. The morning sun was beginning to warm the glass, and she could see her breath forming small fog patches against the surface. Outside, the yard looked exactly as it always did. A few scattered lawn chairs, Mrs. Patterson's small vegetable garden, and the large oak tree that provided shade during the summer months. But the radio traffic was definitely coming from somewhere close by. As she listened, Sarah began to recognize the format and structure of the communications. This wasn't just random military chatter picked up from a distant base. This was operational traffic, the kind of real-time communications that happened during active missions or training exercises. Her heart began to beat faster as memories of her own time in communications flooded back. She remembered the weight of responsibility that came with handling sensitive information, the precise protocols that ensured messages were transmitted accurately and securely. She remembered the satisfaction of being part of something larger than herself, of playing a crucial role in operations that mattered. The transmission paused, and in the brief silence, Sarah could hear her own breathing and the distant sounds of Norfolk waking up around her. Cars starting, dogs barking, the everyday symphony of suburban life. But then the radio crackled back to life, and what she heard next made her sink onto her couch in shock. The voice was calling out call signs, checking in with various units and personnel. Sarah recognized the procedure immediately. It was a standard communication check, the kind performed regularly to ensure all units were operational and ready for tasking. But as the list of call signs continued, she heard something that made her blood run cold. Raven 77 report status. Raven 77. That had been her call sign during her last deployment on the Montgomery. Sarah hadn't heard those words spoken aloud since her discharge, and hearing them now, in her civilian apartment on a Tuesday morning, felt like stepping through a door into her past. She sat perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting to see if she had imagined it. But the voice continued down its list, calling out other familiar call signs, names she remembered from her unit, her ship, her life before everything changed. This wasn't a coincidence or a random transmission picking up old traffic. Somehow, impossibly, someone was trying to reach her. The coffee in her mug had grown cold, but Sarah barely noticed. Her hands were shaking slightly as she processed what she was hearing. Either she was having some kind of breakdown, or someone from her past was attempting to make contact in a way that defied all logical explanation. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving only the normal sounds of mourning in its wake. Sarah remained on her couch, staring at the patio door, wondering if she should investigate further or simply accept that her mind was playing elaborate tricks on her. The rational part of her brain insisted that there had to be a reasonable explanation, but the part of her that had spent years trusting in things that couldn't always be explained was telling her to pay attention. She looked around her apartment, seeing it with fresh eyes. The familiar surroundings suddenly felt different, charged with possibility in a way they hadn't been in months. Whatever had just happened, it had broken through the routine that had been holding her life in stasis. Sarah picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Tom Rodriguez, her former supervisor on the Montgomery. They had kept in touch sporadically since her discharge, exchanging brief messages about mutual acquaintances and general life updates. Tom had been one of the few people who seemed to understand what she was going through, having faced his own challenges transitioning between military and civilian roles during his career. She started to dial his number, then stopped. What would she say? That she was hearing phantom radio transmissions in her apartment? That someone was calling her old call sign? It sounded crazy even to her, and she was the one experiencing it. Instead, Sarah set down the phone and walked back to the kitchen to refresh her coffee. As she poured the hot liquid into her mug, she made a decision. If the transmissions happened again, she would be ready. She would listen carefully, take notes if necessary, and try to determine their source. If her mind was playing tricks on her, At least she would face that reality head-on. And if something genuinely mysterious was happening, she owed it to herself to find out what it was. The rest of the morning passed quietly, but Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on her usual job search activities. Instead, she kept glancing toward the patio door, listening for any sound that might indicate another transmission. The anticipation was both thrilling and terrifying, a reminder that she was capable of feeling something other than the numbness that had characterized most of her days since leaving the service. By noon, nothing else had happened, and Sarah began to wonder if the whole experience had been a product of her imagination after all. But something had definitely changed. The apartment no longer felt like a prison of routine and disappointment. It felt like a place where unexpected things could happen, where the past might reach out to touch the present in ways she never could have anticipated. As she prepared lunch, Sarah found herself humming an old Navy song, something she hadn't done in months. The melody felt rusty on her lips, but familiar and comforting. For the first time since her discharge, she allowed herself to remember the good parts of her service without the bitter overlay of how it had ended. Whatever had happened that morning, whether real or imagined, had reminded her of who she used to be. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the beginning of discovering who she might become next. 3 days passed before Sarah heard the transmissions again. She had almost convinced herself that the Tuesday morning incident had been a stress-induced hallucination when the familiar crackle of radio static filled her apartment once more. This time she was prepared. It was Friday morning, and Sarah had deliberately altered her routine. Instead of her usual spot by the laptop, she positioned herself near the patio door with a notebook and pen. She had even downloaded a radio frequency app on her phone, though she wasn't entirely sure it would help identify the source of the mysterious communications. The transmission began at exactly 6:47 a.m., 7 minutes later than the previous occurrence. Sarah noted the time and began transcribing what she heard. The voice was the same male speaker, calm and professional, running through what appeared to be a standard communication check with multiple units. Echo base to all stations, morning communication check. Whiskey 2-1, report status. Whiskey 2-1 operational, all systems green. Copy that, Whiskey 2-1. Delta 5-5, report status. Sarah's pen moved quickly across the paper as she documented each exchange. The format was exactly what she remembered from her service, but the call signs were a mixture of familiar and unknown designations. Some she recognized from her time on the Montgomery, others seemed to belong to units she had never encountered. As the check continued, Sarah tried to triangulate the source of the transmission. She moved carefully around her apartment, noting that the signal seemed strongest near the patio door, but remained audible throughout the living room and kitchen. The sound quality suggested a relatively close source, but she couldn't determine the exact direction. Then came the moment she had been both anticipating and dreading. Raven 77, report status. The silence that followed stretched for several seconds, longer than the normal pause between transmissions. Sarah found herself holding her breath, her pen frozen above the notebook. Finally, the voice continued. Raven 77, please respond. We show you as active on our roster. Another pause, and then, all stations, be advised that Raven 77 may be experiencing communication difficulties. Continue with standard protocols. Sarah's hands were trembling as she wrote down every word. Someone, somewhere, was trying to reach her using her old call sign. But more than that, they seemed to know she was receiving the transmissions, even though she hadn't responded. The phrase, communication difficulties, felt deliberately chosen, as if the operator understood her situation without her having to explain it. The transmission ended a few minutes later, leaving Sarah with pages of notes and a head full of questions. She spent the rest of the morning researching radio frequencies, trying to understand how someone could be broadcasting directly to her apartment with such clarity and precision. Her internet searches led her down rabbit holes of amateur radio operators, military communication protocols, and conspiracy theories that she quickly dismissed as irrelevant. By afternoon, Sarah had made a decision that surprised even herself. She was going to respond. The local electronics store was a small, cluttered place run by an elderly man named Pete, who seemed to know everything about radio equipment. Sarah explained that she needed a basic two-way radio capable of transmitting on military frequencies, carefully omitting the strange circumstances that had led to this purchase. Pete raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions beyond the technical specifications she requested. "You know these frequencies are restricted for military use," he said as he rang up her purchase. "I'm not saying you can't listen, but transmitting could get you in trouble with the FCC." Sarah nodded, understanding the risks, but feeling compelled to move forward anyway. She had spent months feeling powerless and disconnected from everything that had once given her life meaning. If someone was trying to reach her through naval communications, she owed it to herself to find out who and why. That evening, Sarah tested the radio equipment, familiarizing herself with the controls and making sure she understood how to operate it properly. She had maintained her technical certifications even after her discharge, partly out of habit and partly because keeping those skills sharp had felt like holding on to a piece of her former identity. Saturday and Sunday passed without any transmissions, leaving Sarah to wonder if the mysterious communications followed some kind of schedule or if they had ceased entirely. She found herself waking up early both days, positioned by the patio door with her radio and notebook, but heard only the normal sounds of her neighborhood coming to life. Monday morning brought a change in routine that Sarah hadn't expected. Instead of the usual communication check, the transmission that crackled to life at 6:52 a.m. was different in both tone and content. "This is Admiral Margaret Chen, call sign Phoenix 1. I am addressing this message specifically to the operator known as Raven 77. Sarah nearly dropped her pen. Admiral Chen had been her commanding officer during her final deployment, a woman she had respected enormously and whose opinion had meant more to her than almost anyone else in the service. But Admiral Chen had been killed in a helicopter crash 4 months ago. Sarah had attended her memorial service. The voice continued, and despite the impossibility of the situation, it was unmistakably Admiral Chen's distinctive cadence and tone. "Raven 77, I know you can hear me. I need you to understand that your service did not end with your discharge. There are missions that require your particular skills and experience. Operations that exist outside the traditional chain of command." Sarah's rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that someone was playing an elaborate and cruel joke on her. But the voice was so perfectly Admiral Chen's, down to the slight emphasis she always placed on certain words and the way she paused between important points. "I cannot explain through this medium how I am able to communicate with you, but I can tell you that your country still needs you. There is work to be done that only someone with your background and current circumstances can accomplish. If you are willing to listen, key your radio twice and wait for further instructions." The transmission ended, leaving Sarah staring at her radio with her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. Every logical thought in her head insisted that this was some kind of breakdown, that the stress and isolation had finally caused her to snap completely. But another part of her, the part that had always trusted her instincts even when they led her into dangerous territory, was telling her to respond. She looked around her apartment, taking in the job rejection emails still open on her laptop, the bills stacked on her kitchen counter, the walls that had begun to feel more like a prison than a home. What did she have to lose? With hands that shook only slightly, Sarah picked up her radio and keyed the microphone twice. Click, click. Then she set it down and waited. The response came immediately. Thank you, Raven 77. Your willingness to engage confirms what I already knew about your character. Tomorrow morning at 0700 hours, you will receive detailed instructions for your first assignment. This work will be classified at the highest levels, and you will be operating under protocols that do not officially exist. Do you acknowledge? Sarah stared at the radio for a long moment, fully aware that responding would cross a line from which she might not be able to return. But the alternative was continuing to drift through her civilian life without purpose or direction, watching her savings dwindle while she applied for jobs that would never capture her interest or utilize her real capabilities. She keyed the microphone once. Acknowledged, Raven 77. Prepare yourself for a return to service unlike anything in your previous experience. Phoenix 1 out. The silence that followed felt different from the usual end of transmission quiet. It felt pregnant with possibility, charged with the kind of energy that Sarah hadn't experienced since her discharge. She sat by her patio door for another hour, staring out at the yard where nothing had changed, but everything felt different. Whatever was happening to her, whether it was real or an elaborate delusion, it had given her something she had lost. A sense of purpose. Tomorrow morning would bring answers, or at least more questions worth pursuing. For the first time in months, Sarah found herself looking forward to dawn. She spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous anticipation, alternately questioning her sanity and researching everything she could find about classified operations, military contractors, and government programs that operated outside normal channels. The internet was full of speculation and conspiracy theories, but nothing that seemed to explain her specific situation. As evening approached, Sarah realized she was feeling something she hadn't experienced since her discharge. Excitement. Whatever tomorrow brought, it would be different from the endless cycle of job applications and rejection letters that had defined her recent months. She was being called back to service, even if she couldn't understand how or why. That night, for the first time since leaving the Navy, Sarah laid out her clothes with military precision, set her alarm for 0630, and went to sleep with the anticipation of a mission briefing dancing in her dreams. Sarah woke up at 0615 without needing her alarm, a habit from her military days that civilian life hadn't been able to break. She moved through her morning routine with a precision she hadn't felt in months, showering quickly and dressing in clothes that felt more purposeful than anything she had worn since her discharge. By 0655, she was positioned by her patio door with her radio, notebook, and a cup of coffee that she was too nervous to drink. The familiar weight of anticipation before a mission briefing settled over her shoulders like an old, comfortable jacket. At exactly 0700, the radio crackled to life. Good morning, Raven 77. This is Phoenix 1 with your operational briefing. The voice was unmistakably Admiral Chen's, clear and authoritative despite the impossibility of its source. Your mission involves investigating a series of personnel disappearances from active-duty Navy ships over the past 18 months. These disappearances have been classified as routine transfers or medical discharges, but our analysis suggests a coordinated pattern that threatens national security. Sarah began taking notes rapidly, her training automatically kicking in, despite the surreal circumstances. Admiral Chen continued with the kind of detailed briefing she remembered from her active duty days. 7 sailors from different ships and units have vanished under circumstances that appear unrelated on the surface. Each was a communications specialist with high-level clearances. Each had access to sensitive operational data, and each disappeared within 48 hours of their ship's return from classified missions in the South China Sea. The Admiral paused, and Sarah could hear what sounded like paper rustling in the background. Your unique position as a discharged communications specialist makes you invisible to normal military oversight while maintaining the skills necessary to investigate these disappearances. You will be operating under a classified directive that officially does not exist. Sarah found herself leaning forward, completely absorbed in the briefing despite her lingering doubts about the reality of the situation. Your first assignment is to make contact with the family of Petty Officer James Morrison, who disappeared from the USS Hartford 3 weeks ago. His sister lives in Virginia Beach, approximately 1 hour from your location. She has been asking questions that the Navy considers inconvenient. The transmission provided specific details: an address, a coffee shop where Morrison's sister worked, even her schedule and the best times to approach her without raising suspicion. The level of detail was both impressive and slightly disturbing, suggesting an intelligence network far beyond what Sarah had imagined possible. You will identify yourself as a freelance journalist investigating military family support services. Your goal is to learn what Morrison told his sister about his final mission and whether he expressed any concerns about his safety or the nature of his work. Exercise extreme caution. If our analysis is correct, the people responsible for these disappearances are still active and dangerous. Admiral Chen's voice took on a more personal tone. I know this is asking you to trust in something that defies rational explanation, Raven 77, but I also know your character and your capabilities. You have always been willing to serve even when the mission requirements were unclear or unconventional. This situation demands exactly those qualities. The transmission ended with coordinates for a dead-drop location where Sarah would find additional resources and a secure communication device. She was instructed to check the location at 1400 hours that day and to report her findings from the Morrison contact within 72 hours. Sarah sat in silence for several minutes after the transmission ended, processing what she had just heard. The rational part of her mind insisted that she was experiencing some kind of elaborate breakdown, that stress and isolation had created this fantasy of returning to meaningful work. But the details were too specific, too well-researched to be the product of her imagination alone. She spent the morning researching Petty Officer James Morrison online, finding exactly what she expected. A brief notice of his medical discharge, a few social media posts from family members expressing concern about his sudden departure from the service, and a LinkedIn profile that had been inactive for 3 weeks. Everything aligned with the information she had been given. At 1400 hours, Sarah drove to the coordinates Admiral Chen had provided. They led to a small park in Norfolk with a series of walking trails and scattered picnic areas. Following the specific instructions she had been given, she located a particular bench near a pond and found a small package hidden beneath it, secured with waterproof tape. Inside the package was a smartphone with military-grade encryption, $5,000 in cash, and a set of identification documents that identified her as Rebecca Walsh, a freelance journalist specializing in military affairs. The documents were flawless, complete with a credit history, professional references, and even a portfolio of published articles that she could find online under that name. That evening, Sarah called the coffee shop in Virginia Beach where Morrison's sister worked. Using her new identity, she arranged to meet with Lisa Morrison the following day under the pretense of researching a story about family support services for discharged veterans. The drive to Virginia Beach gave Sarah time to think about what she was doing and why. She had crossed a line from passive recipient of mysterious communications to active participant in what appeared to be a covert intelligence operation. The smart thing would be to turn around, destroy the documents she had been given, and seek professional help for what was clearly a psychological crisis. Instead, she found herself energized by the prospect of meaningful work for the first time since her discharge. Whether this was real or an elaborate delusion, it was giving her something she desperately needed: a sense of purpose and the feeling that her skills and experience mattered. Lisa Morrison was a slight woman in her mid-30s with tired eyes and the kind of nervous energy that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. She agreed to meet with Sarah at a quiet corner table in the coffee shop where she worked, speaking in low tones during her break. "James wasn't the same after his last deployment," Lisa said. stirring sugar into her coffee with shaking hands. He came home for a few days before he was supposed to report back to his ship, and he was different. Paranoid, I guess. He kept checking his phone and looking over his shoulder like someone was watching him. Sarah took careful notes, using her journalism cover to ask detailed questions about James's behavior and any specific concerns he had expressed. What emerged was a picture of a sailor who had encountered something during his final mission that had deeply unsettled him. He asked me weird questions, Lisa continued, like whether I thought it was possible for the government to make people disappear without anyone noticing. And he wanted to know if I would be able to take care of our mom if something happened to him. It was like he was preparing for something bad. The most significant detail came at the end of their conversation. James had given his sister a small storage unit key and told her to wait 6 months before checking what was inside. If he was fine and back in touch, she should forget about it. If something happened to him, she should open the unit and contact a specific reporter whose name he had written on a piece of paper. "The 6 months aren't up yet," Lisa said, "and part of me hopes he'll come back and tell me this was all some kind of misunderstanding. But I know my brother. He was scared of something real." Sarah left the meeting with more questions than answers, but also with a growing sense that she was investigating something genuine and potentially dangerous. The pattern Admiral Chen had described was beginning to take shape. Sailors with sensitive knowledge becoming concerned about their safety and then disappearing under official circumstances that their families found suspicious. That evening, she used the encrypted phone to report her findings to a secure number that had been programmed into the device. The response came back within minutes, acknowledging her report and providing instructions for her next assignment. Over the following weeks, Sarah conducted similar interviews with families of other disappeared sailors. Each conversation revealed the same pattern: personnel with high-level communications access becoming increasingly paranoid after classified missions, expressing concerns to family members, and then vanishing under circumstances that seemed routine on the surface but felt wrong to the people who knew them best. The investigation led her to a network of defense contractors, foreign intelligence operatives, and military personnel who were systematically identifying and eliminating sailors with access to specific types of classified information. The disappearances weren't random. They were part of a coordinated effort to prevent certain operational details from becoming public. Sarah's final report, transmitted through the encrypted phone 3 weeks after her first assignment, contained evidence that would eventually lead to arrests, court-martials, and a complete overhaul of security protocols for sensitive military communications. Her work had uncovered an espionage network that had been operating within the Navy for more than 2 years. The last transmission she received from Admiral Chen came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 weeks after the investigation had begun. "Outstanding work, Raven 77. Your service has prevented significant damage to national security and potentially saved the lives of other personnel who might have been targeted. This operation is now complete." Sarah waited for more, for some explanation of how Admiral Chen could be communicating from beyond the grave, or for details about what would happen next. Instead, she heard only, "Your country thanks you for your service, both past and present. Phoenix 1 out." The transmissions never resumed. Sarah kept the radio equipment for months, listening every morning for some sign that her mysterious assignment might continue, but heard only static and the ordinary sounds of her neighborhood waking up. Gradually, she returned to her job search, but with a renewed sense of confidence and purpose. The skills she had demonstrated during her investigation led to consulting opportunities with private security firms, and eventually to a position with a government contractor specializing in communications security. Sarah never learned whether Admiral Chen had somehow genuinely contacted her from beyond death, whether she had been recruited by a covert intelligence unit that used unconventional methods, or whether her mind had created an elaborate framework that allowed her to investigate a real conspiracy while maintaining the illusion that she was following orders from a trusted superior. What she did know was that the experience had returned her to meaningful work and reminded her that her military training and instincts remained valuable assets. The investigation had been real, the conspiracy had been genuine, and her contributions had made a difference in ways that might never be officially acknowledged. On quiet mornings, when she poured her coffee and heard only the normal sounds of civilian life around her, Sarah sometimes wondered if she would ever again receive a mysterious transmission calling her back to service. Part of her hoped she would, and part of her was grateful for the peaceful routine that had replaced the intensity of those few weeks when everything in her life had changed. But she never forgot the lesson those transmissions had taught her. That service comes in many forms, that purpose can be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important missions are the ones that officially never happened at all.